So hopefully you've already had a chance to start on that multi-part tutorial I've assigned as homework. But yeah, I always like to do my own first demo, so to speak, here. So I'm coming in ready to start a new project. I usually just type MVC up here to search and find, this is what we're after, of course, ASP.NET Core, Web App, Model View Controller using C#, of course, and next. So, by the way, in terms of location, I know you can use the desktop, you can use somewhere in your OneDrive and so on. I'm just going to share with you, I much prefer to just make my own folder right off the root of the C drive, perhaps, or pretty close to it. And yeah, I know that way I'm responsible for making backups periodically and so on and so forth. But I find that I prefer to do it that way as opposed to possibly running into issues, which can happen from time to time, you know, when things are syncing in the background while you're developing. So anyway, it's entirely up to you, but I strongly suggest following an approach similar to that. Okay, I'm going to do a simple demo here. Yeah, we're long past COVID, right? Or are we? Who knows when it might be back again. So we're going to do a little mask demo. Okay, next. Now I'm going to go with .NET 9. And we could go with 8, that would be a legitimate choice as well, but I might as well stick with 9 for now. I'm going to change things up a little bit. I used to do my first demo here with no authentication type, but I find that it's probably best to always be consistent. Students come back and they look at these first videos and they forget that, yeah, it's very important. Going on from here down to the end of the course, you always want to make sure you select individual accounts. It does add quite a few things to our project that we're definitely going to need later on. And it's much easier doing it now than adding it later. So I'm going to do that. Configure for HTTPS, that's fine. Don't worry, we can change how we want to run once we get in there. But I'll just click create at this point. Okay, so here we are. We have an overview here. There's some interesting links here you can follow, have a look at some of this documentation and so on. I'll let you do that on your own, so that's fine. All right, I want to focus on the upper right corner here in the Solution Explorer. And not very surprisingly, we see that things are quite well organized for us from the get-go. And look at that, models, views, controllers, MVC. Wow, what a surprise, right? No, we should not be surprised to see that whatsoever. Now, this data folder, to be honest with you, would not be here if I hadn't checked off that option to add security for individual user accounts, right? It has added that as a result of that option. There's another folder here I want to talk about quickly, areas. The reason for having an areas folder is as an application becomes very large, okay, if it is from the get-go or it grows to be very large over time, often it's helpful to be able to break it up into areas as well. We will never get to that point that we actually have to do that at this stage, but I should point out that one of the things that's already tucked away here in areas is the identity system. Identity is, of course, our actual login, username, password system, right? Now, there's actually not much here at this point, but don't worry, we're going to come back and flush this out and see how we work in this area. Pardon the pun, later on. Okay, so those are our main folders that we're going to be dealing with. And not surprisingly, as I said, we see MVC folders represented there. All right, I'll point out here, there's our www root folder as well, right? So with www root, okay, this is all the basics that we need to support it as a web application. So here we see CSS, JavaScript, and under library, look at this, we have all the jQuery and Bootstrap, right? So I just want to point out here, yeah, sure, we've got, you know, CSS files so on for Bootstrap and JavaScript and so on. You might be tempted to come in here and muck around with this, but don't. Okay, you see right now we're using Bootstrap. We have 5.3.3. That's what is installed here at the moment. It's best not to mess around. These are boilerplate files from Bootstrap. If you want to make customizations, well, that's what these site files are for. So whether it's JavaScript or CSS, right, come in here, and then now you can override and change things to your heart's content. That's the preferred way to go about doing so. Anyways, that's all there to support us as a web application, right? Okay. Moving down the Explorer here, let me point out this app settings. It's a JSON file. Obviously, it's configuration settings, right? Now, something else, this would not be here as well if we had not opted to have individual accounts for security set up in place. So it, as well as added the data folder, it's added a default connection, a connection string. Look familiar? Yeah, this is pretty much the same kind of connection string we were using last term to connect to SQL Server. Now, in a little while, though, we're actually going to come in here and either change or replace or use a different connection string for a different type of database. But just want to point out that that is in here for now. And we'll eventually be adding more settings ourselves into the app settings JSON file. Now we'll get down to the very bottom here in our Solution Explorer. Here's program.cs, right? So here is kind of like the main root of the system in a certain way, you might say. And what do we find in here? A whole bunch of configuration stuff and so on and so forth. But see here that we create with a builder for our web application. And this is the overall builder for the whole thing. And the services collection inside of it, well, remember we mentioned we have built-in support for dependency injection. Anything we add to the services collection immediately becomes available in all of our constructors for dependency injection, right? Which is why we see something here like our add DB context, right? So to pass the connection string for a DB context and so on, right? We're going to later on be making good use of that indeed. So later on, we'll be adding more and more stuff to the services so that we have things available as we're working in our objects and classes. Okay, down near the bottom here, I'll point out a few things. So, sorry, by the time you're done, you finish the builder at that point. Then we're configuring like the HTTP request pipeline and so on, using redirection, routing, authorization, and things like that. This is a really interesting one to kind of pay attention to right now. Map controller route. Okay, so the default route follows this pattern: controller / action and / possibly, or it could be null, an ID, right? And the defaults are the home controller, the index action, right? We'll see how that works in just a few moments. But once it's up and running, well, you know what? Maybe I will. Let's go ahead and run it. And we'll, sorry, I meant to change that first. I didn't want to run with HTTPS because although I can do it here on my system at home, it will be a problem for us in at the college. So let me just pause this for a second. Just to show you, yeah. See here, here at home, yeah, I can run HTTPS, no problem. Okay, let me just stop. I'm going to run again, but let me point out here, when you click this drop down, in our labs, you'll have to make this choice, HTTP, right? Don't worry, though. It will still function the same way for us for now. And when we publish our application live up to Azure and run it from anywhere in the world, it will be set up to use HTTPS, right? So this is a workaround for while we're in the lab itself. Okay, so now we're up and running. And what do we see? Well, I don't see any route up here. I just see the web server itself. But you know what? If I type /home /index, watch what happens. Ah, that's the page we're at. Why not? Of course it is. That's our default. Okay, so I don't have to specify and I get home index. Here, if I click Save Privacy, now you can see home /privacy, right? Now, I don't have too many other places to go, but I just wanted to show you how that routing is actually working up here. All right. Well, actually, let me just minimize it for now. We're going to leave it running. And I'm going to come in here and show you. So we went to the home controller. So let's have a look here in controllers. One of the things that's really a strength, it's a beautiful thing about this MVC approach, is it has a much greater dependency on, you often hear the phrase, convention versus configuration, right? So rather than having a million configuration files all over the place, we often follow naming conventions. So for controllers, whatever name I give the controller here, right, that goes in front of the word controller.cs, that is the actual name that I use in my routing as well. And when I come down to views, look at that. You will see a folder here called home to match the home controller. Inside there, we have two views, index and privacy. Now views, you see, have an extension CS HTML. That's for HTML, of course, but the CS stands for C#, right? So that's how it basically works. So when I come into the home controller, see, it inherits from the controller class, right? down here we have two action results, index and privacy. And notice this, they just say return view. They don't have to even name the view, right? Again, conventions versus configuration. Just following the naming conventions, it's the home controller. If I say return view inside the index action, well, it knows to come down here to the home folder, find the index view, and this is the view that is returned to the page. And there we see it. Nice H1, welcome, learn about, and there's the link there, building ASP apps and so on. And that's exactly what we're seeing right here, right? When I come to home, welcome, learn about, and there's the link, right? But notice something. This is not a complete web page, not at all, right? We have a div here and this little bit at the top. Oh, by the way, this is an example. Hopefully you started that, read through that little explanation of Razor, right? That's exactly what this is Razor code. The little @ symbol and the curly braces mark that everything between there and there is actually C#. So it's an assignment statement here. View data is a dynamic dictionary, right? So we're just adding here that name value pair title, okay, will have the value homepage, right? And that is reflected right here, right up at the top. See, homepage, dask, now we see dash and the name of the project, right? That's okay, we'll get to that in a moment. But if I click privacy, see privacy policy, right? And that is reflected down here. If I open the privacy, you see the view data title is privacy policy. So we're using a little bit of Razor code to set that title for the actual page, right? So how does that actually get into the tab at the top? Well, all of our views are not complete web pages. But if I come down here to view start, for example, by default, we only have one. Okay, when we start, we go to the underscore layout, right? Where is that? Under views, there's shared views here, and there's underscore layout. By the way, underscore is a naming convention to indicate that this view is what we call a partial view. It doesn't stand on its own. It's a partial view to be used in conjunction with others. But our layout here is a full-fledged web page, right? We have our doc type tag at the beginning. Here's the head section, the body, and there's the closing HTML tag and so on, right? What do we see inside the head? Well, as we often do, here's links to things like our CSS files that notice as Bootstrap followed by the site. So if we override anything in the Bootstrap file, we get it from site. And then we can add our own styles and so on and so forth, right? Look at that. Title. The title HTML tag is getting its value from, and here's how we pull that Razor code into the HTML with that @ symbol, view data title, right? So that's how what we're adding to the actual view, for example here, privacy policy, that's how it gets into place in the hosting, you might say, the main web page itself. I just want to show you here, if I come down, now there's a whole header section, I'll come back to that in a second. But see here in the body of the page, div class equals container, main, okay, look at that, a bit of Razor, render body. That is a spot where every view, whether it's the index, privacy, and more views as time goes on, that's where they all get rendered, right here inside render body, right? But of course, there's a little bit more for us. Look at, here's a footer section again. Okay, we have the footer down here with a link to the home controller, etc. We'll talk more about how these links are put together in a minute. And we have our scripts, right? Here's our jQuery, Bootstrap, and so on and so forth. Ooh, this is worth talking about. This is kind of a neat thing, okay? We're saying render section asynchronously, a section called scripts required as false. Well, what does that actually do for us? Well, you know, as I said, we can put our own little bits of scripts here and there. For example, in our site JS file, we can add some script, but then it's automatically, as you can see here, added to every page, because every page, at least right by default right now, it appears inside or in the context of our layout, right? But what if I only need a little bit of script on one page only? How would I do that? Okay, well, let me show you. Let me just come to the index page for a second. Now, what I could do on any one of our views, I could just add a section. If it's called scripts, I could just put some whatever script I want inside here in text JavaScript. So it's my opening and closing script tag. But this whole section then would get rendered or added to the layout here. It's not required, so a page doesn't have to have it, and my index page at the moment certainly doesn't, right? Okay, so that's just showing you how that works. All right, but you know, while I'm running here, I can even fix things like, oh gosh, you know, I don't like that, don't want a space there, mass demo, and I should show you that that's actually here. If I just refresh, sorry, forgot to do this, hot reload. There we go. Now I can refresh. Oh, and oh, it's fixed up there. I'm sorry. I was looking here. I didn't do it everywhere I meant to. My apologies. That is here in the header. Remember I collapsed the header? That's why I didn't see it. Okay, mask demo right there. All right, let me do a hot reload. See, we're making changes to the appearance of the page as we're working. Okay, all right. Well, that's enough about that. I'm going to actually stop running now so I don't confuse myself even more than I am. Okay, so that's basically how, oh, I should show you a little bit here in the header section. What we have is our nav bar. That was that menu across the top. And you notice those two links, right? I did promise I'd come back and talk about this nomenclature here. Okay, you see we're building up, these are links, anchor links, right? But this is not standard looking HTML, is it? No, these are added to the MVC application. These are what we call tag helpers, right? So we can specify for the link that the area would be blank, the controller would be home, and the action would be index, right? When this is rendered as an actual web page for the client browser, the proper path to achieve that route will be put in place, right? But it's much easier for us to use the tag helpers, and that's exactly what we see for our two navigation links here, index and privacy. So let me just run it one more time, because I did want to point out one more thing about this. So privacy, home, not a big surprise there. Oh, here's register and login. Look at that. There's a whole login screen. Register, okay, set up your username, password, and everything else, right? Where are these pages coming from? Well, believe it or not, you can't find them. They're here under areas, right? Pages. We don't see them because right now there's what's called a compressed Razor library, right? Providing those pages on demand. Later on, we'll be showing you how to bring all of them or individual pages out of the library into your code so you can customize them. When in the library, it's very fast and efficient and takes up very little space, but we cannot actually modify them until we bring them in and realize them out of the compressed library as individual pages where we can modify them. But I just wanted to point out that that's all part of the menu. How does that menu come into play? Look at this. After our links for home, index, and privacy, here's a partial view reference, name, login partial. Well, that is right here, again under shared. So here is a partial view that provides that upper right corner of our nav bar, the login area. And see here, if sign-in manager is signed in, so if you're already signed in, right, then you see hello, your name, and there's also a link to log out, right? A log out button. But if you're not logged in, that's where we see the register and login links, right? That's what was available on the screen, and it is still right now as I'm running, right? So I can go home, privacy, but then these pull that code from my register, right? My partial view there. Okay, well, that's probably enough of a tour around. Let's start talking about data itself, right? Because of course, it's a database-driven application. So let's come back once more to the data folder. What do we find in here? Right now, I see a folder called migrations. Now, I mentioned in our discussions last week what migrations is all about, but here as well is a application DB context, right? This was scaffolded because we chose that option for the security system, the identity, individual user accounts, right? So it has created here a customized application DB context inheriting from identity DB context. Now, if you go in and look, you'll find that identity DB context just inherits from DB context, but then already has pre-populated some of the things that we need to work with the identity or security system, right? The constructor, look at this. We're getting options available, okay, being passed into the constructor. Now, we could work with this DB context for our own entities, DB sets, and so on. But typically, I'll leave this one alone and leave it just sitting there to look after the identity system itself. And we'll add our own DB context for our production tables, so to speak, our production entities, right? But this DB context has its own set of migrations. We've mentioned migrations, but we haven't had a chance to look at one. So here's the currently generated migration for creating the identity schema. Now, all migrations will have a up and a down. Because as we mentioned, the idea of the migration is we going to go up through the series of migrations and apply subsequent changes over time. To go down is going backwards, basically. It's like an undo, right? So what I see here is a whole bunch of migration builder create table, right? Create table, ASP.NET roles, users, with all the different properties and data types. Now you notice that this is not yet SQL. This is still C# code, right? And later on, though, this will be converted into the necessary code depending on what database we're using, right? Now, I have to confess, these are written specifically with SQL Server in mind, which is why you'll see some data types, things like nvarchar max and things like that, right? So, yeah, it is written specifically for SQL Server because we defined that that was the database system we were going to start off using. But we have all these create tables. Don't worry, we'll be coming back and looking at what all this kind of code means later on. But I just want to point out that the down or the undo is just a whole series of drop, right? Drop table, drop table, drop table. So that is how we would undo all the creates that happen higher up, right? So that's basically what a migration is. Now the timestamp of this is all zeros because they are going to be in order that you've created them. So you can go up and down through chronological order as you create more and more migrations. Well, that's probably enough for now. We're going to get into actually building something next. But I thought we'd just quickly go through that overview of what's here, what's in the project now, and then we're going to see what we do with it next.